Okay, welcome to another WDCNZ podcast episode. Today I am joined by Ryan Seddon, or the CSS Ninja as he's otherwise known. Hey Ryan, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us on the
Yeah,
podcast.
thanks for having me. Thanks for
So do you
having me.
maybe,
It's good to be here.
for the people who don't know who you are, do you maybe want to give yourself a brief introduction?
Sure. So I guess my main thing is sort of like front end development. I got started when I was younger working in agency land. I got a bit restless, so I started a blog called the CSS Ninja. And kind of like, I guess you said, the rest is history from there. So I kind of dived into some weird and just silly things to do with checkboxes and just sort of my discoveries as I progressed in sort of front end development and went from there. So it's been hugely rewarding to write that content and to have sort of feedback from the community and help the community move forward with new ideas and maybe taking old ideas and making them a bit better.
Cool. And you came over for WDC you came over twice. You spoke at our panel in 2012, but you gave a presentation in 2013. Do you maybe kind of want to dive into what you spoke about in 2013? It was called The Future of Web App Development with Components, but what was the main content?
So the main content for that was about web components. So I was kind of like going over all the features that were coming out at that stage, like the custom element spec, shadow DOM. There was the HTML import specification as well. So it's all sort of like the web component term was an umbrella term for all these sort of sub specifications. So I sort of went through what you could do and what they sort of offered, and kind of thought about this was kind of like the future of how web apps will be made. You kind of piece together all these components into an application. But I guess that's kind of changed in the last couple of years, especially with the introduction of React. It's kind of changed my own thinking, and I think a lot of other people's thinking as well. So it's kind of interesting to see like.
Do you maybe want to kind of dive into kind of how React plays into web components? Because I mean, nowadays, if you say componentized front end, that is what React kind of purports to be.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, I just kind of was hoping you could dive into kind of how web components, where they sit now. Nowadays, if you say componentized front end, you kind of immediately go to React. So how do they play together? And what's your thinking about it now?
So I guess they can kind of play together. I think there was an article. I haven't really explored how you can connect them together because they kind of operate in a different way where React will convert your component into a bunch of just JavaScript functions that'll end up building up the DOM for you in their library. Web components, you register an element or a component, and then that sort of you build up that component from there. So I haven't explored how they work together, but I think, especially the thinking, one of the main things was sort of server-side rendering and how that sort of changed and how web components can't actually do that. Like you can send down the custom elements as like static HTML, but then that needs to wait for your JavaScript to load or your web components to load. Then they need to bootstrap all those web components, and then they actually finally render to the screen. Whereas like React can send down the HTML as it's supposed to be seen by the user, and it can get there faster. And I think that's a really powerful selling point for that, and sort of detrimental to web components that a lot of people have been asking about what's the server-side rendering story for web components and how they work with that, and there hasn't been a really solid answer. Like there's a lot to undermine web components. There's a lot of really smart people working on them, and I'm sure they're really thinking about like how they can solve this problem. But the story at the moment is it's kind of it's not ideal if you want like a fast initial load that React can offer out of the box. I think I've lost you.
Hey, sorry, I seem to have got kicked off there.
Okay.
That was really random. Um, right, where were we? Sorry, you were talking about server-side rendering of web components and how there wasn't really a story there. So maybe, sorry, can you maybe start that sentence again,
Yeah,
essentially?
sure. So I guess web components kind of operate in that you define your custom element, and then that will then tell the browser to load that component. So how you import that with the HTML import spec. So it'll like bring down all your assets for that web component. But there's no way of like pre-rendering that on the server like you could with HTML as you can today. And I think one of the powerful things of the selling points of React is that you can render your application or your components on the server and deliver it to the client. And then React is smart enough to know that it's been pre-rendered, and all it does is just hook up the events. Whereas web components can't do that out of the box. So they're kind of like you can send down the custom elements as HTML, but that doesn't mean they're going to be displaying the correct way. They then need to bootstrap that from your custom element JavaScript. And so there's kind of like that delay. You sort of get that perceived page load speed can be slowed down. But there's obviously ways around. You can bundle in web components into the initial load, but then you still got to have JavaScript run and to bootstrap those. So it's kind of like you always got to be just sending down raw HTML to render straight away.
Yeah. So do you think kind of web components are almost a dead technology? Are they almost dead on arrival now? Have they been superseded by other technologies?
Well, it's kind of interesting that they really wanted to push the sort of two-way data binding, and React sort of changed that opinion on people. Like two-way data binding can sort of get you into a bit of trouble sometimes, whereas sort of React's methodology is kind of like coming back to this single data flow. So you've got this one giant state, and React's intelligent enough to work out what you less complex. I wouldn't say web components is a dead technology. That's kind of a pretty scathing thing towards it, I'd say. But I'd say I'd like to see it develop further and like them to think about the server-side rendering story and how and like not to. I imagine someone could go really crazy with components and be back in like sort of the jQuery UI plugins where you've got 30 plugins and 30 script files and 30 images all coming down. I think they really need to think about that performance story. There's a lot of incredibly smart people working on it, so I'm sure they're really thinking about this. Um, I don't think it's a dead technology, but I think sort of React came and sort of was like that monumental shift that we seem to have every few years in front end development that sort of changes everyone's thinking.
Yeah. So kind of you're now working for Zendesk. Are you kind of using web components at all, or kind of are you excited about some other technology that's really kind of grasping you?
So we've definitely explored web components, but we're actually using React on the project that I'm on at the moment. So we're part of the embeddables team there. So we kind of do a lot of third-party embeddable stuff. That's working in the very hostile environment of other people's websites, which is an interesting challenge. But we're using React in that instance. I guess I've been exploring sort of the full stack as well. So I guess it's kind of interesting on my own developments to explore things like Nginx. I'm sort of been digging into more as well. I think it's
Yeah.
pretty exciting. We're using that quite extensively at Zendesk to do some interesting things. So it's kind of like I'm kind of dipping my toes in other areas, but also I really want to stay in front end development because I really enjoy like the aspects of it.
Yeah. So you're using React pretty heavily. So you've got a little bit of experience of it. And we've actually got a question from one of our watchers. Alex Gibson asks, what are your thoughts on the push for HTML to be constructed in JSX? And now that we're seeing CSS being constructed in JavaScript, I mean, how does that sit with you? No longer are we talking HTML, we're talking
Yeah.
JavaScript all the way.
Yeah, so I guess that was so I was at the actual JSConf announcement when React came up, and sorry, Facebook came up and announced it, and I was, like everyone else, I was kind of repulsed by it. I'm like, what are they thinking? Because they sort of market it as XML syntax, and that just didn't sit well with me. It's only after a while that I started to dig in to look into it that I thought, well, maybe we're only separating our file extensions and not the actual component. Like, it makes sense to me now that the JSX syntax should live inside the component where it's defined. Like, it shouldn't just be a separate file just because it's HTML-like syntax. Like, you have to jump between these files. But really, like, if you do your components in a component fashion where they're small and isolated, it really starts to shine and make sense to have that logic. As for style sheets in React components, I'm a bit on the fence about that. I'm not sure if that's a good idea to have all that inside JavaScript as well. Kind of the way we're doing it at Zendesk is we require it in, so he's like a module system. We require in a CSS file that's part of that component, and that sort of then has a bunch of other generic components that are imports. So we don't have a component per React component. So for example, a form we've built up of like a button component, a form component, maybe like a notification thing. So if like there's an error on the form or successfully submitted it, rather than just a one component, like we kind of think of it as bits and pieces coming in. So I'm not sure how that will work. Like at the moment, that's working really well for us to just import a CSS file. But I'm not. It's interesting to see how people are thinking about how they can bring JavaScript inside the component as well. It's interesting, yeah, but I'm not sure how I feel about that yet.
Fair enough. I mean, do you kind of see this is the future of the way that we're going to be building web apps from now on? Has React just won, or are you still on the fence? I mean, you're using it, I guess, so that kind of that shows that you like it enough. But are there other models that are going to come through and win?
Well, I think we're kind of been through that. So I guess if you were to plot front-end development on a graph, you would see like it would be chopping and changing all the time. And I think we've finally got to that peak where we're all come to agreement that maybe this is a good idea of how we should go forward and build web apps. And it sort of makes sense. We kind of tried all these different ideas and they've kind of worked. They haven't worked in every scenario. And now we've kind of come to this conclusion that like a single data flow is a really good idea for managing complex state. The virtual DOM is a really good idea for not having to worry about when to update bits and pieces. The library can handle that for you. And I think React's done a really good job of selling the ideas, because like Ember now with their HTML bars has sort of taken on the same concepts of the virtual DOM. And have implemented it into their framework. So I think the future is still going to be like you pick a framework that's right for the job. Like React, I don't heavily complex web app. Maybe Ember is a good idea. So Zendesk uses Ember, but they're also taking on the ideas of what React sort of talked about, and I think it's benefiting all the frameworks and the whole community. They're coming to this sort of conclusion of single thinking, that sort of the ideas rather than the library is the right way.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're bringing you back to kind of CSS, which is, I mean, you're called the CSS Ninja on your website. Do you kind of see a lot of changes coming into CSS? It's like we haven't really been hearing a huge amount about CSS. It's all about JavaScript and React and everything else. I mean, are you keeping in touch with the latest changes of CSS as well?
I guess the biggest thing is kind of we're getting proper layout specs now. So Flexbox is pretty well supported. We went through 3 revisions, but I think we've got to a really good stable sort of layout system that's really powerful and really easy to learn. Like it feels a bit weird at first, but I think Flexbox is like a really good attempt at doing like more complex layouts in the web. As for like new stuff, I guess there's not really that much going on that I've been following. I guess variables and kind of like bringing ideas from like Sass. So they've got their own ideas of mixins and having like nested CSS. So kind of like, I think they've called it CSS hierarchies. So you can kind of, in Sass, you can nest multiple classes inside the curly braces to build up like a chain of selectors. And that's kind of like flowing back into CSS natively in the browser. But the way it works, it'd be a long time before you can actually do that in the browser without having to have like a preprocessor like Sass or less or something like that.
Yeah, which one do you use? Are you a Sass guy or a less guy?
I use Sass. So it's kind of like I don't really have a strong feeling either way, but it's kind of, we just sort of naturally went towards Sass. I think because I think the one thing that sold me in Sass was kind of how it worked really well using the ampersand with like a BEM CSS sort of naming style. So rather than having to repeat the parent class, you can just say end and it'll reference like the parent that it's nested in. I think that made it really powerful for me. I'm not sure, maybe less has that now, but at the time, I don't think it did. That was like the one big selling point for me to dig into Sass.
Yeah, so what are your biggest challenges at the moment, and what do you kind of see the biggest challenges of web developers going forward? Is it how do we do layout, or is it how do we do data, or is it more around things like performance or other things that are taking charge, as it were?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us is definitely performance, especially comparing to native apps. It's kind of like this shift happening at the moment, especially in India. So they've got this website called Flipkart that's now shutting down their website and going to apps only, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of like the stage of, like when America had the landline telephones, and now like a lot of the countries are skipping all the cabling and going straight to mobile. It's just kind of like all these new countries coming up with getting internet access now are kind of skipping websites because the speed isn't that great and going straight to apps. And I think that's really like really poignant that we need to work on performance and to make it work over like not so great network conditions. Like not everyone has an iPhone 6 with a 4G connection. They've got varying degrees of phones, and I think we need to be able to fine grain our control of the network, which is happening with service workers, and CSS performance, which is being talked about in the Houdini task force that's sort of started up.
Yeah, do you maybe want to tell us about what the Houdini task force is, for those of us who don't know?
Yeah, so I've kind of been following this a bit. It's only really just started. It's a bunch of like browser vendors and sort of invited experts coming together and trying to work out the challenges of being able to give developers sort of low-level fine-grained access. It kind of ties back to the extensible web manifesto. There was a website started about how we need more low-level access to APIs to be able to build libraries on top. And I think they're kind of taking that, taking what the ideas behind that and being able to give people low-level access. So there's things like being able to define your own custom CSS, which is kind of interesting. So they've got a few sort of really early specifications where it's all just ideas at the moment. So you can define your own CSS properties. You can get access to the render tree, which is kind of like the stage before it gets to the DOM. So that includes more bits, like it includes pseudo elements. It's kind of like the data structure of before the browser takes that and turns that into the DOM and then renders that to HTML to the browser. So it's called the box tree API. And then they're thinking about how they can do layout on a separate thread. So using like a web worker, there's like a special web worker that would be able to do that. And that means that if you want to, you can dig in and really get that fine-grained control, and you won't sort of be skipping frames because the JavaScript threads are blocked up by some other process. And so you can dig in and really sort of create that native experience, but on the web, with all the great things the web can offer already.
So do you think that's what's holding back focus on performance, is the fact that we don't have low enough access to the APIs that the browsers have?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think people really want that access. So, of course, someone can like dig themselves in a hole, but people kind of need that low-level access. You know, like in a native app, if I'm making a game, I can dig right down into like C code rather than Objective C to get that performance. Like, there's an option to do that because people who are doing that know what they're doing. So it's the same in web development. People are really sort of trying to create these really crafted experiences on the web. They really need that sort of low-level access to be able to really control their animations, how it's laid out to create that smooth experience. It's not sort of janky and sort of like sort of like in that weird level of kind of native but not really.
So is kind of performance. Is performance a conversation you're having with a lot of front end developers nowadays? Like, is that what people are getting together and talking about? How do we measure it? How do we fix it? Those kind of things.
Yeah, I think Chrome's doing a really great job of exposing sort of performance metrics in the dev tools. So they've been really updating their timeline tab in the dev tools there, so you can really start to see all the different, like when a layout's triggered, like where like JavaScript's executing, that's sort of blocking from you obtaining 60 frames a second, and so you can dig into paints as well, so you can see like each frame what it's actually painting to the screen, which is really powerful. They're kind of taking a lot of ideas from the tool that they've had exposed to themselves for a while, which escapes me what it's called, but it was behind a flag, and you could really dig into performance metrics of the front end and what happened when you like laid something out. You could really sort of dig into the layers and what sort of methods were called and where the blockers were, and they're now sort of exposing that in a more user-friendly way for developers to access through the Chrome dev tools. So I think on that front, there's really good. Even IE 12, I believe, has some really good sort of UI responsive tools around the performance of your app. So kind of like IE is trying to get on par with like Chrome, so you can be able to debug issues in your browser, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I know from my own personal experience, debugging performance issues can be extremely painful still. But a lot of that is around kind of learning how to use the tools. Do you have any go-to resources that you have seen or have taught you about how to actually debug a performance problem?
Yeah, so one of the Chrome DevTool engineers, Paul Lewis, and someone else whose name escapes me at the moment, actually just released a free course on Udacity, which is like one of those online tools, like online university websites. And that sort of they have like a use case of and sort of digging into performance and how you can find and fix the issues. So I'd highly recommend that. It looks really good, and I think it's that's a good resource for people trying to learn what's going on with the performance issues and how to debug them.
Okay, I'll make sure we include a link to that one on the podcast show notes. So kind of a web developer coming in now who wants to pick up skills. I mean, you've mentioned a whole bunch of things. You've mentioned kind of React. You've mentioned kind of low-level APIs and the performance tools. Kind of what would be the most exciting thing that you would push new developers towards learning? You know, what's going to be the skill that takes them forward?
Oh, it's a tough one. I guess really understanding how the browser works is a really powerful knowledge to have as a front-end developer. Like there's a lot of articles saying like you should do this to increase like perceived page load. You know, like there's a lot of talk about inlining critical CSS, and people just take it as wholesale, but they don't know why. And I think if you start to understand how the browser works, it starts to make sense, and these things can really help you as a developer upskill and know exactly what's happening in the browser. Like if I do this and I know the browser's going to do this, and it's kind of like they've really defined like the way that a HTML file is passed and turned into the DOM is kind of pretty standard across all browsers. It kind of gets a bit harder when you start to dig into how how things are sent to the GPU and how things are painted to the screen is kind of different per browser, and there's no sort of one true document to tell you how it all happens. But I think if you kind of learn what a browser does when you push enter and like it receives the HTML, like I think that's really powerful to learn. I highly recommend, if you don't know how that works, to learn about that.
Yeah, do you just do that from following the engineers and the Chrome team and the IE team, or are there other ways that you can learn all this stuff? How did you learn it?
So,
I guess.
so there's a few talks, I think, and there's a good documentation on the developer.google website. We'll probably have to link that up too, about sort of what happens when the browser receives a string of HTML and how it turns that into like a render tree, and how the render tree becomes DOM, and how CSS comes into that, and how JavaScript comes into that. There's some good documentation out there. That's kind of how I learned it, and just asking people who sort of already knew that, just experimenting and just learning from other people. Really, that is how I sort of picked it up. It's sort of picked up over a long period of time. I don't think there's one sort of thing you can sit down and just learn how everything happens. It's kind of just trial and error and just asking the right questions, I think.
Okay. So how big's your team that you're working with at the moment at Zendesk?
So we have 5 engineers, product manager and a designer on our team. So we kind of try to keep our team small. So smaller teams work better with sort of the agile process. And I think we sort of have like a part of Zendesk that we control and that we work on. So we've got about 5 engineers.
So you said you work on the embedded apps within Zendesk. Can you talk to some of those challenges that you get when you're embedding your stuff into other people's pages and vice versa?
Yeah, so I guess the main thing is you never know what someone's going to do on their website or how they're going to render it. So the one thing that we do is we always render inside an iframe, because you can never trust that someone isn't going to override a built-in method on their website, so that could break your code in some. So we render but that also presents challenges around how you make the user experience nice, because inside an iframe, you have to be able to talk outside and resize your iframe if content changes, and how you do animations becomes way more complex. So there's kind of these weights between protecting yourself from the hostile environment that is third-party websites, and being able to create like a really nice user experience, and to have all the nice animations and flow of how someone goes through your application that's embedded.
Yeah, so I mean, so you've got your set few techniques that you're using there. As browsers get a bit more advanced, are there technologies that you're going to be able to kind of employ more and more to help you out? Or is it kind of something that they're not even thinking of?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting. Like, so one thing I'm really sort of interested in at the moment is service workers. So service workers kind of gives you a way to be able to intercept network requests in JavaScript before the page is rendered. So it's kind of like the better version of application cache plus way more. So you can intercept, like, so if you're offline and the person's already loaded your page before, you can intercept certain requests to certain API endpoints and return like control the response. But that only works if you control the website. Like, I think that'd be really powerful if you could use a service worker as part of something that's not necessarily on the website itself. So if we could control the call, so when our script loads, it calls home to get a configuration file. If we could control that request and say if someone's offline, then we can just return like a cached version that we have stored in the browser. That'd be interesting. So yeah, it's kind of a lot of the new stuff is kind of if you control the website, but there's no real things around helping third-party people embed stuff on websites. I guess it's not really like a major use case for them, so we kind of have to work around those challenges. There is one more thing. Sorry.
Yeah, carry on.
There's another attribute for iframe that's been talked about for a long time, but the support has been not very great. I can't remember what the attribute is, but basically you apply it to the iframe, and then the browser will treat it if it's like a div. So then if the content in the iframe resizes, then the iframe will resize automatically and it'll sort of blend into the page. I think it's called seamless, the attribute, if I remember correctly. But that hasn't been really well supported across browsers. So that's kind of like that was kind of something helpful for third-party embeddables, but not something that's been explored or pushed ahead.
Yeah, I mean, kind of how do you see the future of kind of web app development from technologies? Kind of in 5 years' time, do you still think we're going to be having the same troubles that we're having now, or do you think like the whole kind of way that we build web apps is going to change in like 5 years' time?
Well, I hope it doesn't change, but like front end development seems fast. I think, like I said, I think we've really got to that sort of that peak point of like where all these ideas kind of make sense, and it'd have to be something incredibly amazing to really sort of change that thinking. So I really hope in 5 years that we really have this low-level access and that we're on par with native apps, and like there's for a user there's no distinguishment between them. Like it's kind of like just this mesh of like native and web, and it sort of interworks together. That's how I hope it goes in 5 years, that we have like the browsers become these really powerful conduits, and we can, as experienced developers, dig in to that low-level stuff and be able to craft really, really amazing applications in the future.
Awesome. I think that's kind of a really good place to end our chat today. Is there any kind of plug that you'd like to give at the end? Anything you'd like to say?
Sure. So Zendesk is hiring. So if you live in Melbourne, Australia, we are looking for lots of awesome people. So if you want to work for a great company, come talk to me or check out zendesk.com/careers.
Great. Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for sparing some time to talk to us. And hopefully we'll catch up again soon. Hopefully we'll see you in New Zealand or in Australia, or one of our listeners will say hi.
Great. I'd love to be back. Thanks, Owen.